to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman, Sean, and special guest James, all the way from Davis, California. He's a student there, electrical engineering. What we're doing today is to install a lift, a mild lift on James' truck. He is a college student, like I said, and he's trying to save money, and we're doing him a favor. We're going to put new springs and shocks on the front and new coil springs and shocks on the rear. We are going to document it, so if you're doing the same thing on your rig, you'll know how to do it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take one of the front struts off. We're not reusing his OEM springs, we're going to replace them, but we will need the top plate on the top of the shock to assemble the new strut and spring. First thing we're going to do is we're going to take off this bottom shock bolt with our impact gun. It's a 19 millimeter and we got a 19 millimeter gear wrench on the other side. Okay, that's loose. One thing we're going to do also is we're going to disconnect the outer tie rod, also disconnect the sway bar. This way we can get a lot more movement out of the lower control arm when we're putting in the new shock absorber and spring. So the setup I got to break his outer tie rod free from the steering knuckle of the ball joint is I got this tie rod puller. The tines of the tie rod puller are in between the steering knuckle and the boot of the tie rod. So as I tighten this screw down, it puts pressure on the stud of the tie rod and breaks it free from the steering knuckle. So I'm just tightening this OTC tie rod puller, has a 19 millimeter head on it, and I'm just slowly tightening it down until the tie rod breaks free. And there it is. So now what we're doing is we're breaking free his end link from the sway bar so we could get more movement out of the lower control arm. And I got a 14 millimeter socket on top, and Sean is holding the bottom nut on the end link with that 14 millimeter open end wrench so it doesn't twist so much on us. And we're just gonna take this off. You get the idea. We're disconnecting the passenger side too so we can twist the sway bar off and get it loose. Now we can get full movement out of the lower control arm when we take the shock absorbers off and when we're putting them back in. The strut will be easier to get in with this broken free, and then we're also going to break this passenger side tie rod free also when we get around to doing this side. So now we have the end link disconnected from the sway bar. We have the outer tie rod disconnected from the steering knuckle on the ball joint. We've got this nut loose, but instead of pounding on this to get it out, which could mess up the threads, we are going to loosen the top nuts on the that hold the strut onto the frame, and they're 14 millimeters. So we're just going to use a 1/2 inch drive with a 14 millimeter. Break these free first. Get those all off, and this will, hopefully will allow us to get the bottom bolt out easier. So these two right here you can get to on a socket. The back one, you'll see it's too close to the fender, so we have to use a wrench like a gear wrench, ratcheting open end wrench is what we're going to use to get that one. So for the one in the back closest to the wheel well that we can't get a socket on, we're going to use this gear wrench type of ratcheting wrench. Get it on there, and then we could break it free. So this is the best way to get the back one loose. So the way we got these spring compressors set up is you're capturing as much coil as you can get. You can't really get in there because the spring compressor is too big to fit of that, as low as that. So you get it capture as many coils as you can opposite each other, and then you slowly tighten them, compressing the spring to where you take weight off the top plate to where you could then take this nut off without the thing exploding on you. This is not something that you should do if you're unsure of yourself. So be careful with these because there's a whole lot of stored pressure in these springs and you can get hurt really bad. Things go wrong, all right? So we're gonna slowly compress these both and compress the spring so we can reduce the pressure on this top plate and take this nut off safely. Okay, so we've got these cinched up with a 21 millimeter socket is the size on these Strut compressors that I bought online. We've got them cinched up to where they're not going to move on us now. They're basically equally opposing, so you see they're almost straight across from each other, just a little bit off, but the bend of the spring kind of keeps you from getting it perfect. We are choosing to use an impact gun. We have heard that it's not advisable, but I'm going to modulate how much I do. I'm going to do a little bit each side. This way it's not a total workout compressing these springs because they're pretty stiff. So I'm going to see if I can get the impact gun to do the work. Okay, we got a little bit. See how it's separating? Let's do a little more. See this play right here? That's what you're looking for. Now we can remove this nut without the spring going shooting through a wall or through a person or through your favorite pet or through our guest James, which you probably wouldn't appreciate. So you can see now there's no pressure on this, so we could safely take this nut off now, and I could safely take this spring off this shock absorber. What we want is this top plate because James got new springs, new shock absorbers, but we're reusing the top plate for his new shock and spring. So now we're taking the top nut off. Oh, the shock absorber's twisting on. We got to hold the spindle of the shock while turning this nut. So we have to hold this like with a crescent wrench and then break this free. Instead of using a crescent wrench to hold this, we just put the end of the shock absorber spindle in a vise using a 17 millimeter gear wrench, and we're loosening the top nut for the top plate. And it's loose. So now that we got the old strut out and we compressed the spring so we can get this top plate that we need to reuse, now we're going to compress the new spring so we can get it in the new, get it on the new shock absorber, get the top plate on, and then take the pressure off, and we'll be ready to go for the side. Okay, let's see where that gets us. How close we are. What we're doing is, okay, we got the spring on just to see where we're at on our spring compression. We got a new bushing underneath, the new bushing on top with the top plate, and we're still coming up a little short on getting this thing threaded all the way down the top nut. So we're going to compress the springs compressors a little more to where there's a little more play here, so we can get the nut on further. Once you have the new spring compressed, if you are replacing it, you put it on your new strut, your shock absorber, and then the thing that goes on the rod first, this rod, is a washer similar to this. It's got a dished side and a convex and a concave side. So you face the dished or concave side facing up, slide it on there. Then the next thing to go on is a bushing. And this is not the exact type of bushing. The bushing for this application would be bigger, and it would have a raised like an edge on one side, like a nipple. And so you face that facing up also. So you would slide it down like this with the nipple on the top, and then that nipple recesses into a hole on the bottom part of the suspension support. So you would fit that into there, and then the next thing to go is another bushing. They're just like the other one with the nipple facing downward, so it sits into here. Then you would follow it up with another washer with the dished or concave side facing downward, and then you put a nut on top, which is this one. It says to torque it to 18 foot-pounds, but I think that's, could be an arbitrary number, because depending on how stiff of cushions you got or bushings you got with your new shocks might affect that torque spec. So what I did is I just cinched it down good enough to where it felt tight, and there was a good amount of threads showing on the top of the spindle. I know that that nut is not going to come off. And going out to my truck, I'll show you the example. As you can see that, I got a good number of threads above the top of the bolt, probably 5 threads. So that, that's some type of a good indication that you've got enough threads there that bolt's not going to go nowhere. We had difficulty getting the nut started with the washer because the bushings are new and they're not compressed yet. So it was hard to get the nut started with the washer on the top, even by like pushing down as hard as we could with our hands. So what I did is I put just the nut on without the washer. I was able to get that started on the threads of the spindle, and then I just tightened it down a little bit to pre-compress the bushings enough to where I can get the washer on and the nut, and then tighten it down, you know, like I said, just enough to where it's compressing the bushings, and you got a good amount of threads showing above the nut. All right, so I hope that makes sense. So again, convex washer facing up first, bushing with the nipple facing up. Then you slide your suspension support on. You put another bushing with the nipple facing down into here. You put the convex washer facing down on top, and then you put the nut on top of that, and you tighten it all down. And I hope that makes sense. You could try the 18 foot-pound torque spec first, see where that gets you, but if you only have a few threads showing, a couple threads, I would tighten it down a little bit more so you have a little bit more thread showing, a little bit of extra insurance. Okay. We're using the bottle jack to put a little downward pressure on the lower control arm so we can get the bolt out easier. So, because you could pound it out, but you may risk a chance of messing up your threads. The bottle jack to compress it a little bit so we can get it out. I don't know if this is working or not. Is there a sweet spot? There's a sweet spot right there. That's it. So get the bottle jack in here, tighten it up just enough to where the bolt you can remove the bolt free. So you have to play around a little bit too much, a little bit not enough of expanding the bottle jack. The base of the bottle jack's against the fender, and then the extension part is going on top of the upper control arm. When you get the sweet spot, you should be able to pull the bolt out with your hand without damaging the threads. That's the idea. That's what you want to do. So now that we got the bottom bolt out, we're working on the top ones, which are 14 millimeter, just using a 1/2 inch drive socket, 14 millimeter on the top. This back one again, I don't know if I can get on there. On this side you can get on there. The other side you couldn't, but this side you can. So once these are free, we'll be able to pull the strut out, compress it. Okay, all 3 nuts on the top, the 14 millimeter nuts on the top, the bottom bolt is free. Should be able to pull this thing right out, just like so. This is your strut assembly, and we're going to compress the spring again like we did on the driver's side, so we can get this top plate out so we can use it with the new spring and shock. Okay, so we're going to go in with the strut. We're going to get the top end first. Get the 14 millimeter nut started. Okay, we got all those started. And then now we're going to work on getting the bottom in. So what we do, get your bottle jack out of your Forerunner, have the extending part going against the upper control arm. Pull down. That's because of the, hold on a second. There we go. So get your pry bar underneath here. This is a good purchase point. Pry down a little bit so you can get your bottle jack in easier. And we came up with the bottle jack piston part right about here, and the nut of the upper ball joint kind of will keep it from skidding out on you. Try to get it as square as possible against the fender. And then now I could take the pry bar out of the way and just extend this by hand at first. And then grab the tools that come with your truck to extend it more. So basically, we're pushing against the fender. It's going to drive the lower control arm down to where we can get the bottom part of the shock lined up with the bolt hole so we can get the bottom bolt in. Before we took the strut off the truck, we marked a center mark to where we can get the top plate in the direction we wanted it in relation to the spring. And so now, after we took the strut off, compressed it again, and twisted the whole assembly, you could see now that the end of the coil spring is in the right position where the coil is ending up parallel with the tire. And this is the way the factory service manual says to do it, and we corrected it on the driver's side, and now we're going to work on the passenger side. On this one, the spring is pointing in the wrong direction. You could see the end of the spring is right here, and this one needs to be actually rotated about 90 degrees counterclockwise to where the end of the spring will end up somewhere around here, and the part of the spring will be parallel to the tire. Okay, here's the passenger side. Again, before we took the strut off, we put a mark here pointing out towards the tire, and so we could use that as a reference. And now you could see that the end of the spring is facing outward. The spring is parallel to the tire, and so this is, again, the way the factory service manual says to do it. Here's the factory service manual page. It's in the suspension and axle section, page 57 of the 2000 Toyota repair manual. The reason why they show you these bolt patterns for the left side and the right side is so you can get the coil spring in the right position. It says right here, you face the lower end of the coil spring to the outside of the vehicle. And when you look at the part schematic, you could see that the bottom plate that the spring sits in on the strut, the end of the coil sits right there, which would be parallel with the tire. So if you imagine you move this over to here, would be parallel. And so I have the springs in the wrong position. So I'm going to pull them off the vehicle, recompress them, turn the springs, and fix my mistake. You see where the end of the coil is here? This needs to be rotated about 90 degrees clockwise to where it comes around and it's facing right, the end of the coil be right about there where the part of the coil is perpendicular to the tire. This thing twisted.
I'm going to have my assistant James here. I'll turn it a little more.
How's that looking? Pretty close. Okay. We're going to see if we can get the bolt started. So we get our pry bar underneath here, pry up a little bit, then try to get the bolt in.
Not quite there yet. There we go. I'm pulling it out.
Let's see if I can go down the ball jacks a little more.
There we go.
There we go. Let's do the last final little tap in with a mallet. There we go. Now all we got to do is get the washer on, the nut on, and we'll torque the bolts to spec. We got the bottom bolt in. We're just going to take the bottle jack out of our way now so we can get a wrench in there to tighten the top nuts. Okay, we're torquing the upper nuts for the strut to 47 foot-pounds. There it is, clicked. That's 47. That's 47. This one, I'm going to need to use a shorter socket or just do it by hand. If I can get it on there first. I don't think it's, well, there we go. The bottom bolt is torqued to 101 foot-pounds. You might have to hold this end to tighten it, to get the nut tight, but on the other side it didn't move on us, so we're thinking it's going to be the same on this side. So we're just going to try it without holding the other side, see if it works like the other side did. And the click lets us know we're at 101 foot-pounds. We're putting the tie rod, castle nut back on, got the tie rod back on, and the torque spec for the outer tie rod nut is 67 foot-pounds. And that's it. So now we're going to get the end links attached to the sway bar again, and I have some extra polyurethane bushings, so I'm going to hook James up with some polyurethane bushings for his end links. Don't reuse the cotter key for any application. So we took the old cotter key out so we can get the castle nut off the outer tie rod. So we're using a brand new cotter key. Slide it in there. Sometimes if the hole doesn't line up with the slots on the castle nut, you might have to turn it just a little bit more to get them to line up, but I'm able to get it in. I'm putting the top part, the little part that's a little extended a little further out on the top so I could bend it back over the top of the nut. Just grab a hold of it, top part, and bend it back over the top. That's all there is to it. And you could bend the bottom part down too a little bit, just like that. Now that's basically your safety in case the nut loosens up. The cotter key will keep the castle nut on. Now that we have the front struts in and the front wheels on the ground, we are going to now work on getting the rear springs and new shocks in the rear. So first thing we're doing is going to disconnect the bottom bolt for the shock. It's a 17 millimeter. Just going to use the impact gun to loosen it up. Okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm just using a little pry bar, pushing against the washer and in between the part of the frame that the shock attaches to, and just sliding it off. There we go. And it's free. So what I got going on here is I'm holding the upper part of the shock with a big pair of channel locks. Up above, you can see that the upper part of the shock is hidden in that dished out area of the frame. So what I have up above is a long 14 millimeter socket on a 3/8 inch drive. That's turning the top nut of holding the shock on, while I'm holding the shock body, upper part of the shock body, with this big pair of channel locks, so it doesn't spin on me. So, okay. Okay. One pain in the ass shock out. We just knocked the other one out right now.
We're going to take this off so the sway bar is not fighting us. We have a 14 down here to hold it in place, and we got a 12 on the top. We're going to start to loosen this up until we break this free.
According to the factory service manual, that you take off this parking brake bracket. It's a 12 millimeter, not on there very tight, breaks free really easy unless you're maybe somewhere in the rust belt. I'm just threading the back end so I don't lose the bolt. Now we've got both shock absorbers out. We've got both end links for the sway bar disconnected from the frame. So now we should be able to lower the jack. The hydraulic jack is still underneath the differential. We should be able to lower this and be able to flex the rear end just enough to where we could pull out the springs by hand. I'm going to lower this down a little bit. How's that brake line looking? Okay. I'm not even... Okay. So...
Got it.
Okay. And the driver's side spring is out. This is your bump stop. We'll be putting that back in with the new OME 906s?
Yes.
906s, okay. Push down on it again. There we go.
Just gotta twist it in place.
Okay. So with the help of a buddy putting a little weight on it, we got the spring in the right position. There is different spring numbers for driver's side and passenger side. So we got the right one in. We got the bump stop back in. And you just got to remember that, see where the end of the coil spring hits this stop right here, so you just got to make sure that's seated correctly. And it was in. That's it. That's all there is to it. So remember to get this washer on first. The concave side goes towards the frame member. The dished out side goes towards the shock. Just compress the shock with your hand and then slide it on the post. It's a little bit of an angle, but you can get it on there. Pound it on enough to where you can get the bolt started. Here we are. Finally got it on enough. And we're just tightening it with a 17 millimeter. We'll torque these down with a torque wrench. Okay, so the bottom shock bolt can be torqued to 47 foot-pounds. And that's 47 foot-pounds. Right there. Okay, we'll do the other side. You have a bottom washer with the concave side facing up towards the bushing. So that goes on the shock first. Then you got the rubber bushing. And then you put the other washer on that the Bilstein kit comes with, and it has a little nipple that fits into the hole where the shock goes through. So when you're ready to put the top pieces on, you slide the rubber bushing on first, then you put the washer on top like that. You put your nut on. And with the Bilsteins, the spindle will twist on you. So what you got to do, you have to put this 5 millimeter Allen wrench into the spindle. It's got a 5 millimeter head on it. So you could hold the spindle. So basically you have to twist it to where the wrench rests against the frame somewhere. The 5 millimeter Allen wrench is holding the spindle from moving while you're tightening the top nut. The upper nut that holds the shock absorber onto the upper mount, there's no way you're going to get a torque wrench in there, so just get it tight enough to where you got pretty good resistance. You've compressed the rubber bushings and it just feels tight, because like I said, you're not going to get a torque wrench in there unless you're a lot better than me. And because you have to have the 5 millimeter Allen holding the spindle of the Bilstein shock from turning, you can't get a socket on there with the 5mm Allen on top, so you have to use a gear wrench type of wrench, and you can't get a torque spec from that. So just cinch it up tight so you could see how it's recessed in here. You could see it's down in this recessed spot right here. So you can see how difficult it is to do. Okay, we're done with James' lift. This is James you're looking at right now. Can you tell the viewing public what we actually put on your truck?
So we put on Bilstein 5100 shocks all the way around, and 99 Tall Highlander front coils paired with OME 906 rear coils.
Okay, let's go out to the truck and see what it looks like. And I'd have to say, it looks pretty damn bitchin'. So I would call this a success. So again, this is James, who we helped out today, Davis student, soon to be a kick-ass electrical engineer, Sean, and Timmy the Tool Man. Thanks for watching. Timmy! This is our disclaimer portion of the video. So, James, you do realize we're just regular dudes with some knowledge on automotive mechanics, and we're helping you out, but we are not professional mechanics. We are not insured. We're just doing you a favor, and at the same time recording it so other people can benefit from what we're doing. You understand that?
Yes, sir.
Cool. Right on. So please don't sue me. Thank you. Go turn it off and charge it from moving while you're tightening the top nut.